It's my opinion that when you talk about some of the writings of Blavatsky, the voice of the silence is very underrated and underappreciated. It seems to me that the secret doctrine gets a lot more press. Now, you might say that, well, its secret doctrine is well over 1,000 pages, and it should, because the voice of silence is 316 verses, rather small book. But I'll show you some statistics that I pulled recently. Today, actually, I pulled them from the from the Campbell Research Library. And you'll be surprised. Actually, between the Secret Doctrine, I've read, both of them I've read, The Voice of the Silence. I actually think The Voice of the Silence is the much more practical book for most people. I also know that a lot of people have a hard time even understanding the secret doctrine. But everybody, I'll just give you an idea. Here's some statistics to support my statement that the voice of the silence is underappreciated. I went through some of the journals over the years, and I started with our friends up north, the Canadian Theosophist, which over a period of 87 years, it mentioned the secret doctrine, either in articles or book reviews, 213 times. How many times do you think the voice of the silence was mentioned in that 87 years? You would 8 times, 8, less than. So then I looked at the American Theosophist, which stopped publication in 1996, but that was in publication for over 6 decades, 63 years. During that time, the secret doctrine appeared either as articles or probably mostly articles, 79 times, whereas the voice of the silence was 4 times. 4 times in 63 years. Then I looked at the Theosophist out of India over a 142-year period of time. 135 mentions of the secret doctrine and 56 of the voice of the silence. Now that's pretty respectable. That's not a bad ratio, 136 to 56. 213 to 8 and 79 to 4. That's pretty poor. Then I looked at the Quest magazine in its 33-year history. Secret Doctrine mentioned 19 times. The Voice of the Silence 11. So that's those statistics show you that much more attention has been given over the years in all our journals to the secret doctrine. And hopefully we can kind of rectify that by focusing on this book that I feel is underappreciated. So there are many, I'm going to open the slide up here. You can all see that? Okay. So there are many editions. Those are just 2 editions. But the one that I like a lot is the Quest edition from 1992. I'll hold it up here, and it's got these. It's a really elegant book. It's small. It's got the gold embossed pages, and this has an excellent historical introduction by Boris Dezerkov. Then I have the Adyar Centenary edition, which is the one I've used. You can see it's falling apart. I got writing and markings on every page. These are all small copies. Then I came across this copy, the Jubilee edition, 1939. It's the same text. The cover is very plain, but it's got a wonderful introduction, almost 100 pages by Arya Asanga. And that's the difference between some of these editions of The Voice. They might have a different preface, or not a preface, but a different introduction. By the way, Arya Asanga sounds like a Hindu guy. Don't let that fool you. It's an English guy. He changed his name when he went to India. Then last but not least, I have the miniature edition, which is about 4 inches by 2.5. And this one you can put right inside your shirt pocket. So there's many editions. I would just recommend whatever you get, try to get one with numbered verses. That really makes, especially if you're doing a class together, it really helps to have numbers to refer to. So the historical background of the voice is, I'm going to just very briefly say that it was written in France in the year 1889. It was published 2 years before HPB's death. As you probably know, the book has 3 sections, which are called fragments. It has a total of 316 verses. That's all, 316. The longest verse, verse 69, has 203 words. And then there's 2 short verses of 3 words each, verse 100 and verse 195. The most important thing that I'm going to focus on today is not the meaning of the verses. I'm not going to get into the philosophy I'm going to talk about the language, the style, because I think that's very important. And no matter who you listen to giving a presentation, whether it was John Algill, Joy Mills, or if it's Pablo Sender, somewhere during their talk, they're going to mention that the language is so beautiful, and it is. And I thought to myself some years ago, well, everybody says the language is beautiful, but nobody talks about why it's beautiful. So that's what I'm going to do. I thought, you know what? I can do that. I like literature. I like poetry. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. Lawrence Bendit was an English theosophist, and this is from an article called The Yoga of Beauty. And he talks here about the Greek philosophers who used to talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And he says in the modern theosophical movement, we have paid a great deal of attention to the first 2 of these, namely the good and the true, and very much to the neglect of the third, which is, I agree with that. Speaking of Greek philosophers, here's a famous one, Plotinus, and this is from one of his writing. Oh, it's from the Enneads, famous book that he wrote. He says, beauty addresses itself chiefly to sight, but there is a beauty for the hearing too, as in certain combinations of words, like we're going to hear tonight, and in all kinds of music. For melodies and cadences are beautiful, and minds that lift themselves above the realm of sense, this is important, to a higher order are aware of beauty in the conduct of life, in actions, in character, in the pursuits of the intellect. And there is the beauty of the virtues. So this is a short excerpt from an article by Rukmini Devi. She was a dancer, and she's talking about the need for people who want to spiritualize their life to refine their senses. Anything that is crude or coarse interferes with the inflow of spiritual energies. It acts as an impediment. Now we're going to talk about the book, but first generally about poetry. This is a famous English poet, Shelley. You may have heard of him. He was from the English Romantic period. The poor man died at the age of 29 in 1822. He didn't even make it to 30 years old. This is from a long essay that he wrote. The parts of a composition may be poetical without the composition as a whole being a poem. And The Voice of the Silence certainly has a lot of poetry in it. That's why I put that quote up there. The distinction between poets and prose, Shelley says, is a vulgar error. Then he gives the example, Plato was essentially a poet. I don't know if any of you have read the Plato dialogue, some of his. There's a this in, well, you can get the imagery in a English translation of the Greek, but of course the melody of the language, you'd have to know Greek to get that. So this leads us to the question, what is poetry? And that's what we're going to really delve into tonight, specifically the elements of poetry. In order to identify poetry in the voice of the silence, most of this presentation is going to be talking about what are the actual elements of poetry. And I'm going to identify many of those. I'm going to give you examples from poems that you may have read in high school or college, but then I'm also going to show those same elements in passages from the voice of the silence. So we're going to talk about word sounds, different types of rhythm, and figurative language, metaphor, all types of interesting things. Before we do that, though, just as in music, there's different forms of music. In poetry, there are basically three broad categories: lyric, narrative, and descriptive. The next screen defines those. Lyric poetry, that deals with very strong thoughts, very subjective, often looking inward. Narrative poetry simply tells a story, as in Paradise Lost. It's a story. In descriptive poetry, it describes nature, the world around us, using generally very elaborate images. There's a little bit of all three of these in the voice of the silence, but predominantly, it's the first one, lyric. It's really not a narrative. It's really not telling a story, although it seems like that at times. And in some of the passages, there is descriptive poetry, but it's usually only for one or two verses. It doesn't sustain itself. And so, but lyrical throughout, there's strong thoughts, feelings, and introspective all the way through. There are certain patterns of sound in poetry, just as you have it in music. Out of these three broad categories, the only one we have in the voice is rhythm. There is no rhyme and there is no meter. Now, these are word sounds that appear in poetry in general. And we'll cover each one of these six. Well, actually, not the last category. We'll cover the first five categories, only because number 6, which is pronounced onomatopoeia, does not appear in the voice. And I checked every verse to make sure. That's a kind of a weird word, is it not? A term. And what that means is it's a word that resembles the sound that it describes, like bang, crash, whoosh, that type of thing. We don't have any of that in the voice. Now, before we get into all these elements, I want to say, or rather, I want to share something that Shelley said about imagination. This is a very important quote, which we will come back to later. Throughout this, there's 4 lines there. He's comparing 2 things in each of the lines. Reason is to the imagination. And what he's doing here is making a simile as the instrument to the agent, as the body to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. And if you look closely at that and ponder it, you'll realize that he is putting a great deal of importance on imagination, which generally goes contrary to the way most people would think. They would say, oh, no, logic, reason, that's much more important. But again, he's an artist, he's a poet, he's a writer, and you kind of expect that with him. But I think he's got a point here, and we'll come back to that. I think he's got a point that applies not just to artists and writers, but we'll come back to that. Figurative language is, figurative means language that is not meant to be taken literally. It's suggestive, okay? And we have 6 different types found in the voice. I dug all these out. By the way, when I did research on this, I did not refer to an article because there was no articles on this anywhere. There was no book on it. I dug this out myself and figured it out. It took me a long time to do it. Now, you know, item 2, irony. Uh, that is the use of words to express the opposite of the literal meaning. But there are 3 types. There's paradoxical statements, and again, I refer to Paradise Lost. Dark with excessive bright. Paradoxical. Then you have situational irony. We'll get into that a little later. And then verbal, just words, verbal irony. There's 3 types of verbal irony: hyperbole, meiosis, which is not in the voice, and then sarcasm. I think everybody knows what sarcasm is. Hyperbole is a way of exaggerating to make a point. Meiosis is the opposite of hyperbole. So what is that? If hyperbole is exaggerating, meiosis is understating. It's minimizing. And people like to do that when they get caught doing something they shouldn't do. Oh, it wasn't that bad. So we're going to look at all these elements as they appear throughout the voice of the silence. Keep in mind that I said the voice of the silence has poetry in it. And poetry, I feel, and so does Robert Frost, should be listened to. It should be spoken out loud. Falling short of that, you read it in a book like I do. I have lots of books on poetry. But it's best listened to out loud. He says the ear is the only true writer and the only true reader. I know people who read without hearing the sentence sounds, and they were the fastest readers. Eye readers, we call them. They get the meaning by glances. But they are bad readers. They're bad readers because they miss the best part of what a good writer puts into his work. Yeah, a good writer constructs sentences in an interesting way. They call that syntax, makes good use of metaphors and so forth. But if you're racing through it, reading fast, you're going to miss half of it, probably miss more of it. So Robert Frost is correct. And again, if you were to have a group session at the Seattle Lodge on the voice, I would suggest when you study that as a group, read the passages out loud. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the categories of word sounds, which I referred to early in an earlier slide. The first one is alliteration. Many of you know what that means, but the definition is there. The repetition of initial consonant sounds in 2 or more neighboring words. The words have to be fairly close together for it to be called alliteration. It's generally the first letter of the word that matches in a couple of words. And this provides a sense of rhythm. It actually gives it a musical quality. Here's an example from the poet Robert Herrick. I sing of brooks, of blossoms, birds, and bowers, of April, May, of June and July flowers. So the alliteration obviously is not in line 2, it's in that first line. The letter B as in boy, brooks, blossoms, birds, and bowers. It just kind of ties it all together, those 4 words. Very different things, but by using the letter B, it just makes a beautiful sounding passage. In the voice of the silence, in verse 2, the soundless sound, that's alliteration, the letter S. Or in verse 11, the silent speaker. Or verse 69, the voice of virtue. And here in 227, you have 3 times the letter D as in dog, dread, dad, dugpa. It's found throughout the voice. I'm going to show you verse 122. Actually, I'm going to read it before I go to the next slide. Let me find that. I'm going to show you the slide after I read it, and then you'll see it. But I want you to hear it like Robert Frost said. Listen to it. Don't read it. Okay. Listen carefully I'll try to enunciate a little extra on the words that where alliteration appears. But if thou needest husks with Maya's dew, thou canst create but food for the black doves of death, the birds of birth, decay, and sorrow. There's the verse that I just read, and I've highlighted the letter B as in baker, D as in dog, and you'll see dew, doves, death, decay. And a good writer, which Blavatsky certainly was a good writer, will employ that technique. As you're reading it, or maybe as you're listening to it, if you were in a coffee shop, like in the old days in the 60s, they had folk singers and somebody would get up there and read poetry. You wouldn't necessarily be conscious that you were hearing alliteration. It would be kind of subliminal, but it would be there. It would have an effect. But in a book, you can sit back and analyze it, look at the words as I did here. Now, alliteration was the first letter, consonant. Now, assonance is with vowel sounds. Vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, U, they're very pleasing to the ear and they help to harmonize words. Here's another example by the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like the shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. A lot of assonance in there. How about in the voice? This is an easy one, verse 36. Behold the hosts of souls. You see that letter O, that long O sound. The next one, if thou wouldst reap sweet peace. So you have that long letter E, reap sweet peace. Now, just being analytical here, if she had said thou would harvest sweet peace, that would have worked. Reaping and harvesting are synonyms, but you would have lost that effect of reaping sweet peace. You see, very important. Writers, good writers pay attention to which words they use. I'm going to read verse 99 now. This is another one of those. This is right at the end of fragment 1. Yes, let me just double check. Yeah. Behold, thou hast become the light. Thou hast become the sound. Thou art thy master and thy God. Thou art thyself the object of the search. The voice unbroken that resounds throughout eternities, exempt from change, from sin exempt, the 7 sounds in one. So you have that OU, thou, in the first line. Second line, thou and sound. It goes back to thou. Fifth line, resounds throughout. You see, you have that. She weaves that assonance throughout all the lines, and it really stands out when you hear that. It really has a musical quality to it. Okay, consonants. Okay, this is a repetition of consonants. It's similar to alliteration, but in alliteration, the consonant was the beginning letter of a word. Here, it can be in the middle or at the end or in the beginning. And again, it's, as I said before, it's kind of subliminal, but it's also interesting. And even when I say good writers, even people on Madison Avenue, even marketing and advertising people are hip to this stuff. They use it all the time on TV and newspaper headlines. They use it all the time. Speech writers. This is Robert Frost. So what you're looking for here are consonants. The buzz saw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. So you see a lot of the letter S. Oh, saw, snarled, the dust, stove, sticks, sweet scented stuff. There's three in a row. And you also have the letter Z, which doesn't appear in many words. You kind of he bookended this. You have the letter Z in the first, the buzz. Actually, that's onomatopoeia. Buzz imitates the sound of a buzzsaw. Buzz. And then breeze, you got that Z at the end. You think that happened by accident? Heck no, he did that on purpose. That's craftsmanship. That is on purpose, and it's quite clever. Now let's look at what Blavatsky did with consonants in the voice. When he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern, there's that letter S, the one, the inner sound that kills, there it is, the outer. When he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound, just kind of a repetitive sound. It ties it together. Then thou of timid heart, be warned in time, remain content with the I doctrine. Okay, what you have there is the hard letter T, as in timid, heart, at the end of heart, be warned in time, remain content. There's two T's there, hard T's, and doctrine, all through that. And if you look at the prior verse 7, you only had one hard T, the last word, outer. But here you've got quite a few. Now, she may not have known that it was consonants, or that's what they call it, but she knew what it was. I mean, she knew how to use it. She had intuitive ability to do that. More examples from the voice. Armed with the key of charity, of love and tender mercy, thou art secure before the gate of Dana. Thou must have mastered all the mental changes in thyself and slain the army of the thought sensations. She likes that S, self, slain, sensations, that subtle and insidious creep unasked within the soul's bright shrine. So we now go to rhythm. There we go. I was having problems getting to the next page. All right, this is a word you don't see every day, unless you're an English major. Anaphora, the repetition of words at the beginning of a sentence or phrase. Whereas before we were dealing with letters like vowels or consonants, alliteration or consonants. This is anaphora, are words or even a whole phrase. And it gives a mesmerizing effect. Now let's see some examples. It also happens that there's a difference psychologically between two-part groupings, which connote a sense of fairness or authority, such as we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. In the voice, you find that for either he shall win or he shall fail. It's one way or the other. It's this or the other. It's on or off. That's two-part groupings. But if you go to three-part groupings, this is very common. It gives a sense of something is believable, it's reasonable, it's examined all the options. This is from an essay on studies by Bacon. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. There's something psychologically humans, when they hear a two-part grouping versus a three-part. It has a different effect. And Blavatsky uses both of these. When to himself, blah, blah, blah. I left the dots there because it's a long verse. When he has ceased, 6 and 7 both start the same way. And then it concludes in verse 8, then only, etc. Now, verse 15 is a long verse. When to the world's turmoil, etc. When to the roaring voice. You see that repetition. When frightened, it's when deafened. If any of these criteria apply, learn, O disciple, of thy silent God, thou art an unworthy shrine. More examples, a little bit further at the end of fragment 1. Hast thou not passed through? Hast thou not conquered? Hast thou not sinned, destroyed? You see, she employs that technique, that repetitive technique. It gives a kind of mesmerizing effect. Now, this one is also anaphora below, 70 through 73, but you say, oh, David, the words aren't repeating. True, it's not the same word, but it's very strong verbs. The first verb is very strong. Kill thy desires, strangle thy sin, silence thy thoughts, merge into one. So in that sense, it qualifies as anaphora. Now we have another type of rhythm here, which is called parallel structure. Veni, vidi, vici. Some of you may have heard that quoted. That's from Julius Caesar, from a letter he wrote to the Roman Senate in the year 46 BC after he was victorious in a battle. He gave them a report. Very short report. I came, I saw, I conquered. Kind of arrogant. So the order of subject and verb is repeated, giving a sense of continuity. That's a very famous, you hear that many times quoted. Who shall approach them? From the voice. Who shall first enter them? Who shall first hear the doctrine, etc. Again, have mastery over thy thoughts if thou wouldst cross its threshold. Have mastery over thy soul. You see the structure. It's a parallel structure, very effective. A lot of good writers, well, not so much, definitely poets use this a lot. Poets use that quite a bit. Now we are getting into what I feel is the most interesting part of this presentation. We've talked about word sounds, we've talked about different rhythmic patterns, but the largest part of my presentation I will deal with these figurative devices. Devices that are not meant to be taken literally. And the voice of the silence is loaded with them. It's loaded. So let's take these one by one. Before that, though, let's return to Shelley. Remember this quote? Reason is to the imagination. We looked at that earlier. This is important because figurative language activates, stimulates the imagination. And imagination is another topic we're going to return to. We'll see that there's the higher and lower forms of imagination. We talk about higher manus, lower manus. Same is true of imagination, but we'll get to that a little later. Synecdoche, a figure of speech in which a word or phrase that refers to a part of something is used to represent the whole. This is one you hear quite a bit on the news when they're talking about troops being sent overseas, boots on the ground. Soldiers wear boots. But boots here is a case of synecdoche, one article of clothing referring to the idea of a soldier, or set of wheels for an automobile, part of a car, wheels referring to the entire car. How about in the voice? Or wait, I have some poetry first. Rumi, the Sufi poet, my restless heart journeyed all over the world. I mean, if you took that literally, I don't know how his heart could take a vacation, and he must have had a replacement heart pumping or something. So obviously, that's a metaphor, right? My restless heart, meaning his emotions, his feelings. He yearned to journey. And here's Dorothy Parker, celebrity from New York in the 1920s and 30s. Though you may wander sweeter lands, you will not soon forget my hands. Is she talking really about her hands? No, she's not talking about her hands. Her lover, her boyfriend, has left her, and what she's saying is, "You're going to miss my hands caressing your shoulders and so forth. You're going to miss me," but she doesn't say you'll miss me. You're going to miss my hands. Synecdoche. Now in the voice. False learning is rejected by the wise and scattered to the winds by the good law. Its wheel revolves for all. Its wheel revolves for all. Wheel, the wheel of karma, the good law. If thou art told that to gain liberation thou hast to hate thy mother, tell them their tongue is false. Synecdoche. It's the idea, the statement that you have to hate your mother to gain, that's what's false, but poetically it's, but tell them their tongue is false. Now we have irony. Remember, there were, this is a general dictionary definition, the use of words to express something other than and especially the opposite of the literal meaning. This is often done with a little bit of humor, light sarcasm, and sometimes outright ridicule. It depends. Or it could be a state of affairs that is the reverse of what is to be expected. Like if Susie's a mother, and she keeps telling her little Johnny, you have to be on time. You have to be on time for school. You have to be on time for your music lessons. And then the day Johnny has a recital playing on stage at the high school, the mother gets a flat tire and she's late. That would be very ironic and frustrating too. So the first one we'll look at is paradox. That's a statement. And we get a lot of this in spiritual literature, certainly in the Secret Doctrine, everywhere. It's a statement that seems to be a contradiction at first glance. This is a but then if you look at it, consider it, meditate on it, it's true, but you can't quite maybe explain why it's true, but something within you senses it is true, maybe at a higher level. Two examples, verse 243, thou hast to study the voidness of the seeming full, the fullness of the seeming void. The Secret Doctrine also early on has a couple passages similar to that. Doesn't use the word fullness, it uses the word plenum, which means the same thing. This next paradoxical statement is kind of a play on words, and here you have to actually see it in print. The way to final freedom is within thyself. That way begins and ends outside of self. Well, you don't have to see it on print, but it's a lot. It gives you a clue. If you can see that those two words are characterized very differently, it's obvious that they're referring to two different things. Now, sarcasm. Okay. It's a cutting rebuke, often delivered with a tone of contempt, derision, disgust. So the setting of this little verse here is Dorothy Parker is expressing herself after a love affair that ended badly. Oh, life is a glorious cycle of song, a medley of extemporanea, and love is a thing that can never go wrong. Yeah, and I'm Maria of Romania. It's the last, you don't get that as sarcasm until you get to that last line there. Then you know, oh yeah, she didn't mean any of that. So in the voice, you might not think, oh no, David, there's no sarcasm in the voice. I beg to differ. You look at that last one, they were talking about two different approaches, the two different paths. The first one there, referring to somebody who thinks they know, but the first repeat in pride, well, that's your first clue that they still are retaining pride. Um, these three verses, to really understand why they're are sarcastic, you have to really, we don't have enough time tonight, but if we were doing a longer presentation, what I would do is lead up to each of these with a few preceding verses, and then you would see how it fits in there. So there is actually, there's not much of sarcasm in the voice. I think these might be the only three that I found. Very little, but it's there. Now here is situational irony. The English are so nice is the name of this by D.H. Lawrence, who was an Englishman, so he can say this, okay? He's putting down the English, but he's English, so he can get away with it. The English are so nice, so awfully nice. They're the nicest people in the world. And what's more, they're very nice about being nice, about your being nice as well. And if you're not nice, they soon make you feel it. So he's mocking this facade, these mannerisms that the English have, this social protocol, which is in many cases just a facade. It's really not how they truly feel. So that's ironic. Now, in the voice, this is a little bit situational irony. This is a little easier to explain than the sarcasm one. Alas, alas, that all men should possess Alaya, be one with the great soul, and that possessing it, Alaya, should so little avail them. Alaya, the footnote, universal soul, a priceless gift, the spirit, universal spirit, you might say. And the irony is that every human being has this, but they're unaware of it. And it doesn't do them any good because they haven't tapped into it. That's irony. Hyperbole. I like this. This is a language that kind of exaggerates. It sometimes is extravagant. Um, it can make things seem better or worse than they really are, or more intense. But it's not it's not distortion. There's a difference. Distortion is when you're deliberately trying to mislead somebody, you're trying to deceive them, okay? You're trying to lead them down the wrong path. Hyperbole is not like that. It's used to emphasize or draw the reader or listener's attention to certain things through the device of exaggeration. We have this here in this verse 36. Kind of stepping, it's a verse where it looks at the human condition. Okay, stepping back and just taking the broad view of human beings everywhere throughout history. Behold the host of souls. Watch how they hover over the stormy sea of human life, and how exhausted, bleeding, broken winged, they drop one after another on the swelling waves. That's a beautiful passage, very powerful. And of course, we know that life isn't always stormy. Um, there are, the sunshine does come through, but this focuses in a very intense way on the storm and the suffering of humanity. And it really is hyperbolic when exhausted, bleeding, broken wing. That's maybe even, you might say, over the top. I think that's good poetic imagery. It gets the point across. And then they drop one another on the swelling waves, the storm. Another one. Strive with thy thoughts unclean before they overpower thee. For it will grow, increase in size and power. And then this thing of darkness will absorb thy being before thou hast well realized the black, foul monster's presence. imagine Vincent Price reading that. He'd probably do a much better job and get the evil, the evil. The fearless warrior and his precious life blood oozing from his wide and gaping wounds will still attack the foe. A little excessive, but it's making a point. And you have other passages like that in the voice. And as you return to the voice and read through the verses, you'll discover many of these. And now, after having heard this presentation, you may not remember the exact term like anaphora or alliteration, but you'll recognize the sounds of them. This is a fun one, simile. Let me just see. I went through all the verses, 316, and I counted over 50 different similes in the voice. It's a pretty high percentage for a little over 300 verses to have 50 of them have similes. What is a simile? Remember, it was that quote we had with Shelley, reason is to the imagination. Those were similes. The dictionary definition, a comparison of two dissimilar objects or situations that have something in common and they're linked by the words as or like. As we saw with Shelley, reason is to the imagination as, and then the similes follow. So this is like that. Something is like something else. That's a simile. My love is like a red, red rose. I wandered as lonely as a cloud. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Those are all similes. Those are famous lines from people that read a lot of poetry. They will recognize them. However, this is not a simile. You hear people talk that way and using that word like I'm like this, like that. To me, that's like grating your fingernails on a chalkboard. It really drives me up the wall. But that is not a simile. Here are some actual similes from the voice of the silence. When to himself his form appears unreal, as, see, the word as do on waking all the forms he sees in dreams. That word as links his form and the forms in dreams. And what that is, I'll just explain that in the voice of the silence, the form is the lower self, the impermanent self. And he's saying it has no, or Blavatsky, the voice rather, is saying it has no more substance than the dreams, the images in our dreams. Here's another beautiful, often quoted one. For the mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. Mind is like a mirror. And so forth. There's many of those. Now, here's some interesting ones. Here, the disciple is compared, if you can't be the sun, in other words, if you can't be a shining spiritual radiance, then be a humble planet, which still gives forth some light, like the moon gives forth light at night, but not like the sun. Down at the bottom, wedged as a stone with the countless other stones which form the guardian wall. So wedged as okay, I guess I should have put the previous verse. He's talking about the Mahatmas, the holy ones who are protecting the world from evil as a stone, etc. In fact, I think I will add that verse next time I do this. And these are just some other, how creative Blavatsky was in her use of similes. Karma compared to a tidal wave. Well, let me just see if I can find that verse real quick here. I won't read all of these. I don't have the time. Yeah. For it is written, teach to eschew all causes, the ripple of effect, as the great tidal wave thou shalt let run its course. So talking about cause and effect, if there's a big effect, it's like a tsunami. You don't want to get in the way of that. Thoughts, hounds, thoughts when you don't have control of your thoughts and they're scattered, they're like dogs running all chasing the fox. Lust is compared to a worm. I like this passage 35. The unwary soul, the undiscriminating soul, the naive soul is compared to a moth. And then they show how the moth gets caught in this viscid fluid, trapped. That's what happens to undiscerning souls. They get trapped in attachments and so forth. The timid soul is compared to a turtle and so forth. They're beautiful, beautiful, very imaginative similes. So we'll return to Shelley now from that 12,000 word essay that he wrote. Poetry, let me just see where I can't see. Oh, yeah. Poetry awakens and enlarges those two things. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself. How does it do that? Well, by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. In other words, things that had never entered our mind before until we read poetry, good poetry. He continues, poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. And that is what Blavatsky does with many of her imagery. That's what a good poet does. A good poet will take commonplace things and describe them in such a creative, imaginative way that it seems like new. Not everybody can do that. You have to have a certain talent to do that. Blavatsky had it. So now we get to the final part of the figurative images, where I actually get into my title of this talk, which is Light and Darkness. Light and darkness in the voice of the silence. And these are metaphors. These are symbols. Now I'm going to explain, before I go into these slides, I'm drawing a parallel here. I'm making an analogy between film, okay, between movies, certain films, and I'm using black and white films. And I'm drawing an analogy between that and the black or light and darkness, the symbols light and darkness as they appear in many of the verses in the voice. So black and white in film, light and darkness in the voice. I'm going to go through a few things here, and you'll see that in the old days in Westerns, they had lazy, producers and lazy screenwriters. So they would just, the guy in the black hat was a bad guy. The guy in the white hat was a good guy, kind of a cliche. And in fact, that's a sign of a mediocre writer or a mediocre screenwriter. But when employed by a skilled artist, black and white becomes more than just black and white. This is mediocrity right here in terms of imagery. Now, the Idiot's Guide to Film said it's extremely important to remember that black and white can be just as subtle as color. Remember, I'm drawing an analogy between black and white in film and light and darkness in the voice. First, he says, black and white is never just black and white. It's all the gradations of gray in between, and silver and beige and so forth. We have a couple of lines from scripture. I form the light and create the darkness, from Isaiah. Light and darkness, often used in religious symbolism as good and evil. They come from the one, the one source. I dare say most Christians skip over that verse. I doubt that there's been too many sermons on that particular verse 45:7 of Isaiah, because it can be really problematic unless one has a more metaphysical understanding of the universe. And from the Tao Te Ching, under heaven, all can see beauty as beauty only because there is ugliness. All can know good as good only because there is evil. So these are not opposites, but complementaries. things that complement each other. Now here is an example from one of the early films in the 1930s using subtle lighting. It's black and white, but look at that. It's rich. It's a beautiful image. Go to the next one. Now what has happened here, it's a whole different mood, is it not? The fact that it's darker. It's not like the one we just saw, which is kind of bright. This is much darker. Of course, she's got her hand on the window, black and white, but a whole different mood. And this is like, whoa, this is really ratcheting up the intensity here. This is from The Third Man, Orson Welles, The Third Man. So most of those images were from 1950s film noir, which I'm a big fan of. Here you see some more images, shadows, lampposts, contrast between light and dark, the lack of hazy images. It's all part of the mood, and you'll get the same thing with light and darkness in the voice, as you'll see in The Voice of the Silence. Here's another stark. This is a German 1920s German expressionism. Very stark image and very spooky, very creepy. I think that was from Nosferatu, the vampire, or one of the early vampire movies. But look at that imagery. So I'm going to pause this here, or rather stop the screen share just for a moment. And I want you to think like an artist. And what are some qualities that just in no particular order that you associate with, let's start with light. Okay, let's start with light. It can be sophisticated or it can be silly, whatever, obvious.
Happiness, one
Okay.
idea.
Well, painters always have to determine where the light is coming from, and that will inform the entire picture.
Warmth.
What's that?
Warmth.
Warmth. Oh, yes, yes.
Warmth. Warmth. Heat. Heat. Warmth.
How about darkness?
Cold.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yeah, or depression.
Depression. Mm-hmm.
Depression.
It can have many different connotations, both of these words. Bill, did you have something? No? All right, let's because we're on the clock here, I want to go back. Okay, you can all see that, right? So these are qualities of light, which I found in The Voice of the Silence. And like beckoning in verse 205, bewitching in 34. Now in verse 34, she actually uses the word bewitch. Verse 242, she actually uses the word bright. But beckoning, that's my word describing the sense I got from reading it. But look at the differences: flickering, glistening, glassy, glaring, glorious, mysterious, mysterious light, pleasant, radiant, shimmering. See, there's some of these have movement: shimmering, flickering, glistening. How about fading light? Verse in the third line, 69, fading. Soft, down at the bottom, soft. Unfathomable, waning. Verse 2, waning and fading, kind of the same meaning there. So she uses the symbol of light in all these different ways. I think, how many are there? There's like, I think 26 examples here, 26 different examples. I'm going to skip this one. And now darkness, check this out. We have 28 different possibilities here. not possibilities, examples. Oh, excuse me, 19, sorry. Darkness approaching. Darkness can conceal, it can hide from view. Darkness can be dense like a fog, but we don't normally think of it. But dim, empty, look at it, murky, impenetrable, nefarious, kind of scary, ominous, nefarious, those kind of go together. Terrifying, veiled, thick. So you see the variety, the wide variety that she employs in those. Now let's look at some actual verses. Light and darkness. First in 255, light here is presented as truth. The one pure light, the light that is free from affection, meaning attachments. Down at the bottom, light is courage, truth, and then courage. The path that leadeth on is lighted by one fire, the light of daring, courage, bravery. Now you have darkness as fear, a dark and threatening shade will fall from thine own heart and root thy feet in terror to the spot. Darkness as evil, it is a shadow of thyself outside the path, cast on the darkness of thy sins. Different feelings, darkness more. Darkness as ignorance, unawareness, not knowing. Behold, all those who knocking for admission await in ignorance and darkness. That's an appeal. That verse is an appeal to the Bodhisattva disciple to go out and help these people, help them find the light. Darkness as illusion. Thou must divest thyself of thy dark garments of illusion. That's a wonderful, dark garments of illusion. You know, we wear garments, right? Especially in northern Illinois when it's 10 degrees outside. You have to bundle up. It covers up your body. But garments of illusion, what do? They cover up the truth. They hide the truth. Darkness as impermanence. Thy shadows live and vanish. They're not permanent. Now light, she does tricks with that too. Light is truth, light is glamour, light is worldly pleasure. So light is truth. Seek for him in the hall of wisdom, wherein all shadows are unknown, and where the light of truth shines with unfading glory. Light is truth. But now she takes light, 2 verses later, that was verse 32, and verse 34, suddenly light is not so enviable, it's glamour. This light shines from the jewel of the great ensnarer. The senses it bewitches, there's that word, bewitches, blinds the mind and leaves the unwary and abandoned wreck. An abandoned wreck. And you can picture that light as glamour. Just picture all the people that went out to Hollywood, thought they'd be a big star, and so many of them ended up falling on drugs and bad things, glamour, not good. Light is worldly pleasure. If thy soul smiles while bathing in the sunlight of thy life, okay, that's fairly benign, it's fairly innocent, it's pleasure. We all, we respond to pleasure. So just those 3 verses, very different uses of the symbol of light. Just to lighten it up, I found this little cartoon. Guy's sitting on a hammock talking on his cell phone. He's probably in Cayman Islands somewhere. He says, I got the grant. I'm researching whether or not money can buy happiness. Well, I don't know. Let me know. Light as pride. Aha. You didn't expect to see pride in there, did you? Step out from the sunlight into the shade to make more room for others. You see, when you talk about somebody who always wants to be in the spotlight because it's all about them, that's a perfect situation where you can use light as pride. Not truth, not bravery, none of that. Pride. I want to be on center stage. I want to be in the spotlight. Now, how about in nature? We talked about descriptive, lyrical poetry, narrative poetry, and descriptive. These will fall into a descriptive category somewhat. Let thy soul lend its ear to every cry of pain, like as the lotus bears its heart to drink the morning sun. That's a simile too, by the way. You see the as comparing the soul to the lotus. So in that verse 59, the sun provides nourishment, sustenance, warmth. But now the same light, the same sun, suddenly becomes fierce. Let not the fierce sun dry one tear of pain before thyself has wiped it from the sufferer's eye. Those are both beautiful. Notice those verses come back to back, 59, 60, and she diametrically uses that sun in opposition. You know, it's like in music, if any of you are musicians, playing the same melody first in the major key and then in the minor key, changing the whole mood of it. She's very skilled at that. Now, how about darkness in nature? This was light in nature. Now we're going to look at darkness. There's some scary things here, some creepy stuff. Believe thou not that sitting in dark forest in proud seclusion. So this verse 132, that the dark here symbolizes isolation and aloofness. Whereas in 231 below that, the road that leads there through is straight and smooth and green. 'Tis like a sunny glade in the dark forest depth. Still the idea of dark, but it's a different thing. What you have there, darkness providing a contrast. The darkness is there to provide a contrast to that sunny glade in the middle where the sun, there's no trees, no leaves. And for that little space in the woods, you get the sun. And to the second gate, the way is verdant too. That means rich foliage, green. But it is steep and winds uphill, yea, to its rocky top. Gray mists will overhang its rough and stony height, and all be dark beyond, because you cannot see those mountains that goes up, and there's mist, and you can't see the top. So what you have here, dark here suggests the unknown or the mysterious. So in the first one, darkness suggests seclusion and aloofness. The next one, it's there to provide a contrast to the sunny glade. And then last, mysterious, the unknown. All right, we now go to another type of figurative language, which you're very familiar with, I'm sure, metaphor. And in his Poetics, Aristotle said it's a great thing indeed to make a proper use of these poetical forms and also of compounds and strange words. Here's the key sentence. But the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. A master of metaphor. I think Blavatsky qualifies. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others. It's also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor, now this is important, implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars. We're going to come back to that and hear other people say the same thing. We intuitively perceive that there's a unity or a common thread between things that on the surface look to be opposite, like with paradoxical statements. From the Secret Doctrine, HBB says, analogy is the guiding law in nature. The guiding law in nature. The only true Ariadne's thread that can lead us through the inextricable paths of her domain. If you're wondering who Ariadne is, look up the Greek myths and you'll find out what Ariadne's thread refers to. Here we go, back to Shelley. Remember what I just, right here, Aristotle, an intuitive perception of similarity in dissimilars. Shelley says the language of poetry is vitally metaphorical. That is, it marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension. We saw that quote before, but it's worth emphasizing. So a metaphor. It's a word or phrase that literally denotes one kind of idea used in place of another. Drowning in money, the golden sunset, twilight of her career. You know, all careers come to the end. All days end with twilight. And so you have a metaphor. Two different things, twilight in a person's career, but it fits. Now here is a poem. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. It's a metaphor. I have asked, each time I do this presentation, I've asked the groups what they think that means. Nobody gets it. It's tough. It's tough. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. John Keats was a poet. He was a writer. I'm going to give you a clue. Remember I talked about Borka's, this elegant book with gold gilding? See the pages? The pages are white, but it has gold gilding on there. Well, in Shelley's day, there were no paperbacks. There were leather-bound books. And if they were quality books, they had gold gilding. And from what I understand, he had a fairly good library. So the realms of gold, he's talking about all the books he has in his library and the many goodly states and kingdoms. Those are states of mind or another worlds. You know, you read a good book, it's like entering another world. And that's what he's talking about. When he, in fact, the title of this is, I'm first looking into Chapman's Homer. Chapman was an English person who translated Homer from the Greek. And anyway, those are metaphors. Here's another one, William Wordsworth. This is the Prelude, famous poem, which I had to study in college. Gently did my soul put off her veil, and self-transmuted stood naked as in the presence of her God. Now, you wouldn't emphasize the word naked as I just did, but I want to make a point there. So what is the metaphor here? He has a veil. His soul took off the veil like an article of clothing, standing naked before the presence of God. Obviously, it's not something to be taken literally, but what it means is that Wordsworth is comparing honest, deep introspection to the removal of an article of clothing. He's going deep within himself. He's seeing the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it as it really is. He's not trying to hide it with a veil, and he's standing before God. Here I am, and that's the metaphor. Beautiful metaphor, very beautiful. In the voice, I found 39 metaphors, and many of these were used over and over. Castles of illusion, we come across that very early. The ladder is one that's the gates of virtue, the walls, the gates of the sweet law, a lot of these. And here you have some pictures resembling some of those metaphors. You have shadows, you have a ladder, you have a stream, you have a path, you have a gate. And I counted up, actually did a word search here, and it turns out that the ladder comes 6 times, shadow is used 15 times, and the path, no surprise there, 63 times. So she uses these metaphors over and over to great effect. Here's one, a little lighten it up. Thy shadows live and vanish. That's verse 138. And this guy is sitting in his office on his desktop computer or his laptop. And he says to death is coming with a sickle, thank goodness you're here. I can't accomplish anything unless I have a deadline. Verse 73 talks about this path being kind of hard. It's not easy. It's uphill all the way. And I thought I'd throw in a little cartoon here. This guy, it may be too much for some people. The guy's walking by a church And it says, now with reclining pews. Don't want to stress you out too much. Personification. All right, this is a good one. There are about 24 cases of personification I found in the voice. What that is, I'm sure you're familiar with it. That's when a writer gives human attributes to abstract ideas or even objects. Like here, Wordsworth, the sea lay laughing at a distance. That works because the sea does, the waves coming in does have a sound. Obviously, the sea doesn't laugh or cry or anything else, but it works in a poetical sense. And Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, why does the sea moan forevermore or evermore? So you can play with personifications like that. And here she does it, the voice of the silence, the voice of flesh, the voice of virtue. It's just loaded. The sacred river's roaring voice, the breath of fear, the flame feels not. Personification, giving human qualities to all these, to a river, to the earth, to a flame, to silence, flesh, virtue. So we have discussed these elements now, all of these, quite a bit, kind of rushed through them, but it gives you an idea. Obviously, the point here is not for you to remember these terms, but to be aware that the voice of the silence is truly poetical. It's world-class poetry, world-class. It's right up there with the best of them. Now we're going to end with a few words about imagination, which I told you earlier we would come back to this. This is from Shelley again, that same essay, A Defense of Poetry. A man, and that means a man or a woman. Back in those days, it was understood. You didn't have to explain it. They knew that it meant male and female. A man, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. Get outside of yourself. Get out of your bubble. Get out of your box. Put yourself in the shoes of another. That's what he's saying. The pains and pleasures of his species, the human race, and even animals, must become his own. I've seen quite a few dog rescue videos on YouTube. They're just lovely, where people go out and rescue these poor suffering dogs. That's very good work, very compassionate. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. I dare say a lot of Sunday preachers, that might be a revelation to them. I'm not saying that to put them down, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about that way in church, at least Christian church. It's all about accepting, believing, accepting, not questioning. And poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. So the key sentence here, getting out of yourself. Now look at this. I repeated that sentence. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. Look at the voice of the silence. It says the same darn thing. Hast thou attuned thy heart and mind to the great mind and heart of all mankind? It's saying, in different words, of course, but the essence is the same. There's no difference there. It's talking about compassion for the suffering of others. Beautifully put. A couple more words on imagination, and then we are done. This is another great poet, Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was a favorite of John Elgio. This is from his biography, self-biography. The imagination, then, I consider either as primary or secondary. Do you remember at the beginning of the talk, I said there were two types of imagination? This is what we're going to get into now. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Very metaphysical, is it not? Very metaphysical. Okay, that's the first, the primary. Let's go to the next quote. The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former being this one, the primary. It's an echo, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. Those two passages are really worth meditating on. I think it contains a lot of truth. Very theosophical, I might add, very theosophical. I think Blavatsky could have identified definitely with that. And here's what she says in the Theosophical Society. In occultism, imagination is not to be confused with fancy. See, that's what a lot of people today think. Oh, it's just your imagination. It's nothing. It's not real. Like little kids, when they can sometimes remember their past life. Oh, Johnny, that's just your imagination. And they beat it out of the kid, and pretty soon they forget. Some kids do remember their past life, but the parents beat it out of them. So, because they think it's fancy. No, in occultism, it's one of the plastic powers of the higher soul and is the memory of the preceding incarnations, which, however disfigured by the lower mind, lower manas, it gets distorted as it comes into the denser fields of our subtle bodies, yet rests always on the ground of truth. That's another one worth savoring. By the way, that's very Platonic. In Plato and another one of the dialogues, I forget, Plato gets into that a little bit. He was a great believer. So here we are. Guess what, folks? We are done. We are done.